Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is going to be a contextualized reading of Glen Sean Coulthard's essay here. And it's part of our Intro to Critical Theory class. And what I've done this week is I've brought us into the 21st century from we were reading, in the 1920s and 1930s, and so I've kind of jumped to the present to give some examples of thought that's happening right now. And what we'll do then is then go back to the 1940s and be building kind of a contour of thinking. It is my professional opinion that I think that in terms of um, critical theory today, I feel like some of the best thought is coming out of indigenous people's thought of various different places, and particularly out of anti-colonial thinking. I've pushed some of my students, and in recent lectures, I talked about that concept from my own book called the Political Theological Vortex, or caution students against trying to find like the author that you're reading, trying to label them as left or label them as right. And I caution that for various reasons about just like, first of all, we're not reading for self-confirmation or our identities. But when we look at indigenous theory, because it's anti-colonial, it's not going to fit right into like Marxian trajectories. It's not going to fit on the right or the left. And it's speaking to 21st century conditions, whether it happens to be, um, the crises that we face. So the environmental crises, for example, that affect the entire globe. Um, so I want to say a little bit about anti-colonial thought because I've gone to conferences. I went to a Telos conference a few years ago and I gave a paper dealing with indigenous issues, and this one loudmouth guy was just like going off at me on in Q&A about, how post-colonialism is dead, and Gayatri Spivak and these like big theorists from the 70s. And the thing is, like, and my response had to be like first of all, I wasn't talking about any of those post-colonial thinkers in my talk. And there's nothing post-colonial about Indigenous people's situation. They are thoroughly um, under the oppression of the colonizer. So it's important to think, whether we're in the United States, that the United States government is a colonizer role. It's again one of the reasons I use the term Euro-Christian, and I have just finished writing a book with my friend and colleague, who's Washache Osage Nation, Tink Tinker, on this stuff. And so I can talk about this stuff for a really long time. And I would like to do maybe another course that more thoroughly covers that kind of thinking, because it's really where I situate my own work right now. But this is an intro to critical theory course where I'm just giving a little tiny taste of someone who I think is a great thinker. So we're going to read this essay by Glen Sean Coulthard. Let me just share the screen here. Um, let's see. There we are. Um, and so subjects of empire, indigenous peoples, and the politics of recognition in Canada. Glen Sean Coulthard is Yellowknives Dene. So Yellowknives is in Northwest Territories. It's way up above, the like way up north of Alberta. Um, uh, right on a big lake up there. And a couple of things to say just about Indigenous people's situation, and what I mean by the ongoing colonizing process, because I think what has happened, and especially liberalism has done this, is it tries to set indigenous people in sort of a distant past or something like that. This happens a lot. And I can hear it in my students thinking, like the way, just like when they talk in class, they don't even realize how they're situating indigenous peoples. Um, Part of that has been part of the colonial strategy is a rhetorical erasure, which is also genocidal as well. But right, but it's the rhetoric of uh, erasing somebody else's history, not talking about peoples that have existed in the United States. It's framing uh, history as starting with the Puritans and going to the present, never really talking about indigenous peoples, relegating them to states of warlike states where weren't the indigenous people they were all fighting each other before the Euro Christians even got here. Which uh, all sorts of really ridiculous, cartoonish things that show up in people's heads because of the way that our own educational system has been a tool of colonialism. And that's why, of course, why we have critical theory is to try and like um, uh, think better, to do a better job at this. And this is probably why I think that indigenous theory is really helpful. Um, for folks who don't know anything about this, I will start, and I can't give a whole lecture on this today, but I would like to. I want to start when it comes to a nation like Canada or the United States or Australia or New Zealand. Um, uh, um, they are nation states that have really latched on to this earlier legal process that comes from the papal bulls of the 1400s, the papal bulls of discovery. There's a longer history there as well. Um, it really kind of goes back to the first slave trading off the coast of Africa in the 1440s between conflicts between Spain and Portugal. And the Pope at the time deciding that they needed to make a decree of where the Portuguese could go to do slave trading and where the Spaniards could go. So we start getting this kind of geological mapping in terms of human trafficking, and it's coming from the Euro-Christian legal context. It does end up becoming international law later on, but there's no way to divorce the theological aspect uh, from the real political on the ground kind of stuff because the only thing that gives them legitimacy is their belief in the Pope at this particular moment in time. So what happens is that there's a series of papal bulls with um, that repeat the same language and law, so they kind of get updated. And the very famous one is called Inter Cetera. It's from 1493, and it's dealing with Christopher Columbus has returned and initiated the transatlantic slave trade because the first thing he does is he takes unwilling captives back to Spain to try and train them to teach them Spanish so that then they can come back and conquer even more. So the intent is completely there. Um, from the beginning. Uh, Inter Cetera repeats this kind of language that says that any Christian prince or subject of a Christian prince can go into another land that is not claimed for Christianity or claimed by a Christian prince and claim it for Christianity. And in that claiming process, they can um, vanquish, subdue, destroy, or perpetually enslave the inhabitants that exist there, right? That's what the papal bulls say, and I will have there are already lectures that have of me online talking about that in much more detail and looking at those papal bulls. We have to fast forward because we get the Protestant Reformation in 1517, and there is a bunch of breaking away from the Catholic Church, but there is not so much breaking away from the language of the papal bulls. In some of my own work and my own chapters, it's the same language that gets used, for example, when uh, King James of England, James the First, gives charters to people in Virginia, and then the colonies that become Boston and the places where the Puritans go right up north. Um, and so basically New England, right? The New England call all of the colonial charters basically repeat the same language from the papal bulls of discovery. So a packaged, all packaged together, this becomes what the doctrine of discovery. And so there's lots of stuff online. There's lots of websites dealing with unpacking doctrine of discovery. It's not just one law or one document. It's a whole apparatus and a way of thinking that continues to exist today. In 1823, there's a big Supreme Court case in the now new United States, right? Although Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer of discovery. He knew that's what he was kind of trained in. So right. So let me just go back a little bit in time. Like um, uh, George Washington is already sort of speculating, and he sets up a land company with his brothers in the 1750s when he's very, very young, and he's speculating in Ohio Valley. He's already looking to in what is clearly Indian territory at the time, and he's already got designs right from a very early age. So we see that, and of course that becomes that land becomes promised to people who had fought in the Revolutionary War. That's how he's trying to pay soldiers because at the time Jefferson and Washington are some of the biggest landowners in the colonies. And they certainly don't want to pay people with their own land. Uh, when the Louisiana Purchase happens, right, in 1803 or early 1800s with um, Thomas Jefferson, and we get the Lewis and Clark expedition in the United States, and they're taking flags, and this is a process of discovery. They bought the U.S. government bought the rights of discovery from Napoleon, right? So it is the conversion of land into property, and the formal procedure of doing that is called discovery. It's the same thing when people plant the American flag or now all sorts of other stuff on the moon, right? There was a bunch of stuff about the moon in the news recently. Um, but that formal ceremonial process, it's religious in nature. It's what Columbus does when he first lands on the island of Guanahani and plants his sword. His sword is the cross, and he renames the land. So he baptizes the land, renames it like a baptismal, like you're baptizing a child, and gives it the name San Salvador, right, in the name of his savior. So that's part of what the Euro-Christian process of discovery does, is that it converts land into this thing called property, which is completely foreign to indigenous peoples. Um, in 1823, the famous case is Johnson v. McIntosh. And in that case, John Marshall, who's the head of the Supreme Court at the time, introduces um, formally introduced. He says that the pretensions, he does use the word pretension, but he says that the U.S.'s claims to legitimacy um, stem from the papal bulls of discovery, right? So it's this connection to that legacy of Euro-Christian stuff, and a lot of my American students like have this kind of, idealized version of a separation of church and state, and it's like that is just clearly a place, and if we want to. One of the questions might be like, well, what would happen if we overturned Johnson v. McIntosh, which says that Native people can't sell land to white people because Native people don't own it in the first place. The US government owns it. So the only kind of land negotiations that can happen between the settlers is with the US government and not with the actual Indians or natives. I will switch the term indigenous, Indian, and native out. It's important to keep attention to the fact that I know, of course, it's a cipher that like Columbus wasn't in India. He thought he was India when he landed, and that's where the name comes from. But in terms of legal language, um, it's important to keep some of the original terms that are used as well. Um, And just know I'm kind of maneuvering through multiple terms that are each in their own way problematic. Okay, so why do I mention Canada and New Zealand? And so all of the Anglo countries, like the US, Canada, that come out of the old British Empire, so New Zealand and Australia, they all in their laws maintain adherence to the doctrine of discovery. It happens in other places too, so we could talk about South America, but it's like the four sort of Protestant Christian nations um, have this built into their laws, and it made them not sign on to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for the UN 2007 thing, at least not officially not. So like they were the nations that drug their feet longest in terms of signing on to that because they know what their legacy of genocide is, and it's also in their legal systems too. So the question becomes now in the United States, for example, if we signed on to this international treaty and we're going to be um, live up to that promise, then how do we renegotiate the ways that Christian domination exists in our own legal system, right? So, for the conventional, the liberal, self-congratulatory liberal person, right? They they will think of like, well, they have a secularization narrative. So like, why are we talking about Christianity and all this sort of stuff? It's like, well, if you talk to indigenous people, the way that reservations were set up, and the residential schools were set up is through a process of quote Christianizing and civilizing the native person, right? And so it is not that far away. It's like religious domination and oppression. This isn't to say also that there aren't indigenous people who are, self-avowed believing Christians or something like that, right? So when I use that term Euro-Christian, all lowercase, one word, I'm talking about a social movement in which like the political oppression and domination cannot be divorced from the pretensions to theology. And if we want to say that we're not in a um, uh, a time period of that, then I would say, okay, well, that's fine. So then let's get rid of it in our laws. Let's deal with the tragedy that has happened and that continues to occur. So, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, big liberal lawyer, everybody loves her, such a feminist, all this sort of stuff, cites against indigenous peoples in the early 2000s, cites doctrine of discovery, cites Johnson v. McIntosh. And so the thing is, it's not that it was just in law in 1823 or something like that. It still gets used and invoked regularly in decisions against Native people, right? It is current legal domination, and it is ongoing um, colonialism, right? So if we can't situate colonialism as something being in the past, just like you wouldn't want to situate indigenous peoples as being in the past either. So I think that there's something at stake in terms of our critical thinking, especially when we're looking at it. Like I'm under the colonizer U.S. government, and where I live here, and of course, my own family background is that of colonizers here. So what do we can gain, I think, a lot from indigenous folks up north, who are having this discussion because, or even indigenous folks in New Zealand or in Australia, because the critiques end up giving us a big picture of how the domination is still working. And so Glen Sean Coulthard here, he has a really, really great book that came out around 2015 or so called Red Skin, White Masks. It's an updating of this book. Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon, who's going to be a main thinker in this essay. And he's definitely as a reader, he's been reading and thinking about post-colonial theory, which is generally the way the category that Frantz Fanon would be put into. But he, of course, is updating it and critiquing it from an indigenous situation as well. And so when I look back at this essay, it's from 2007. So clearly, I think these are like the beginnings of what becomes even more formulated in Glen Sean Coulthard's book, Red Skin, White Masks, which updates some theories about Marx and stuff too that are not in this particular uh, essay for today. Let's just dig into the essay. I can say more and more about the indigenous history and oppression and legal apparatuses or doctrine of discovery. But that I wanted to at least introduce a little bit of that because to the background and in future courses that you can hopefully see that's where I think that real critical work of 21st century should be situated, at least for me. Um, okay, so he says, over the last 30 years, the self-determination efforts of the objectives of Indigenous peoples in Canada have increasingly been cast in the language of recognition, of cultural distinctiveness, recognition at the heart of an inherent right to self-government, recognition of state treaty obligations, and so on. In addition, um, the last 15 years have produced a proliferation of theoretical work aimed at fleshing out the ethical, legal, and political significance of these types of claims. Subsequently, recognition has now come to occupy a central place in our efforts to comprehend what's at stake in contestations over identity and difference in colonial contexts more generally. In this paper, so he gives us our thesis statement, right? Like, uh, in this paper, I employ Frantz Fanon's critique of Hegel's master-slave dialectic to challenge the now hegemonic assumption that the structure of domination that frames Indigenous state relations in Canada can be undermined via a liberal politics of recognition. Against this assumption, I argue, instead of ushering in an era of peaceful coexistence grounded on the Hegelian ideal of reciprocity, the contemporary politics of recognition promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonial power that Indigenous demands for recognition have historically sought to transcend. So, in this sense, he is anti-liberal, right? He's not necessarily anti-democratic, but he is definitely anti-liberal because the efforts, even the efforts at the liberal efforts at recognition, are perpetuating the same colonial domination that has existed forever. It's just like thinking about it was liberal policy in the United States in the 18 after the end of the treaties in 1868, where you shift all relations from with Native nations shifts from the Department of War to the Department of the Interior, and then we get boarding schools, forced boarding schools here, and the idea, of course, like the famous phrase "kill the Indian, save the man." It's completely genocidal, and genocide will come up in here as well. But and it's intentionally genocidal. It is state policy that is intentionally genocidal in terms of culture and the we are still feeling the effects of that, especially Indigenous people are still feeling the effects of that. But it was considered humane and liberal policy at the time, right? That's the kind of analogy I want to make here. So in the 1990s, if you are thinking about race and philosophies of race and culture, there's a big movement towards multiculturalism and recognition. And one of the big thinkers here is Charles Taylor, who's going to show up in this essay, a Catholic thinker. Um, Wrote a really big book around 2007 called A Secular Age, where he traces that like long history of secularization processes. Sources of the Self is another one of his books. And in the 1990s, Charles Taylor is writing, and he's kind of one of the big thinkers who's in a liberal sense is trying to do some kind of justice work around around recognizing different cultures. Um, and the movement is multiculturalism, right? In universities, especially in the United States, if you're in Asia or something like that, the big discussion maybe since Obama came to office and there was this like big backlash against people of color, especially on the right, along with claims of post-race that because we elected a African American president that uh, it just shows that we don't need to talk about race anymore or something like that. And then of course we get um, the Black Lives Matter movement and this whole um, kind of uh, movement around protest culture, protesting the police abuse or law enforcement's abuse of Black folks, especially Black men, but not always men. And so there's a whole discussion. It's not to say that there isn't old that it isn't the old racism in a kind of new discussion, but sometimes people call it we call in the university culture like it sometimes is referred to as the new racism, um, which basically tries to deny any discussions about race. And this is why the people on the right want to say like, oh, whenever you are talking about race, you're just being divisive for all this. It's like there are all sorts of um, uh, ways to try and not take conversations about race seriously. And then there's the identity politics side of it too, which, if you remember from my earlier lecture on Marx, where I was bringing Marx up to date, where we could look at the ways that in under neoliberal rationality, right, from Wendy Brown's essay from the last lecture, what neoliberalism does is it creates identity categories as marketable things that compete against each other, right? So there is a way that if that neoliberalism's effects have definitely pitted identity categories against each other, that have created all sorts of really difficult conversations and battles in the university culture and the charges of you're a fascist and you're a fascist, that all that stuff is going around from the right to the left and the left to the right. And all, but I think that indigenous theories, if we start taking it seriously, then we can give a different angle to all of those discussions, right? And that's why I think that this is important. And it's not just about like, again, like land acknowledgments, which is like rhetoric, right? It's really popular right now for people to be like hotels in the mountains in Colorado are all, oh, I'm gonna like hang a bunch of pictures of native people and like put some plaques about like their relationship to the land here in all of our resorts, and it's gonna make us be more equitable. It's like, no, like unless you're giving land back, then it's just rhetoric, right? Um, so uh, indigenous theory, I think, can give us a whole different kind of perspective on some of these other discussions that are going on in our current politics, etc. But it requires us sort of stepping out of that kind of right-left zone, and thinking about what anti-colonialism might mean. And then there, of course, I mean, there are people on the right who are just unapologetically colonizers, right? They're unapologetically right-wing Christians who say that the savages should just die or something like that. There are people like on the alt-right that and who are white supremacists who have that kind of thing. Um, uh, I don't have that kind of thing, because I kind of align with the anti-colonial perspective here, without, of course, trying to pretend I'm indigenous. So I want to look at what uh, Coulthard is doing here. He's using an earlier um, Caribbean thinker, Frantz Fanon, and he is digging into this book. Frantz Fanon was a psychologist and um, uh, uh, a philosopher who was dealing with Hegelian philosophy, and notions of identity. And of course, he's, as he says here, the master-slave dialectic. So that goes back to earlier lectures. So I'm not going to retrace what the master-slave dialectic is here for Hegel. Um, if we just start with the intro here, I can't, of course, read the whole essay out to you, but over the last 30 years, the self-determination efforts and objectives of Indigenous peoples in Canada have increasingly been cast in language of recognition. Consider, for example, the formative declaration used by my community, the Dene Nation, in 1975. We, the Dene of the Northwest Territories, insist on the right to be regarded by ourselves and the world as a nation. Our struggle is for the recognition of the Dene Nation by the government and people of Canada and the peoples and governments of the world. So, along with this attempt to seek recognition, is the language of sovereignty, right? This is why Schmidt is important, even though um, uh, he's completely thinking about it in a different context. But when we look at a thinker like Schmidt and his tracing of sovereignty to its explicit Euro-Christian formations, back to Jean Bodin, um, uh, I think that when we now look at sovereignty and the ways that Indigenous people have oftentimes had to like claim something sovereign, that they have the sovereign right to their land, every time they use the sovereign word, they're further entrenching themselves into a Euro-Christian legal framework and a Euro-Christian, a colonial framework. And so now a lot of my indigenous colleagues are pushing back and like what is this notion of sovereignty? And out there on the web, you can Google me and Tinker and sovereignty and Glenn Morris. Tinker and Glenn Morris. We have an online discussion where they're unpacking that whole notion of sovereignty. That's really, really useful. If you are so interested, it's on the New Polis's website, which I used to edit, but I don't work there anymore. Um, so think about that. Just like have the word like the word sovereignty is a form of legal recognition, right? That it's exactly what Coulthard is talking about as a problem here. He says, fast forward to 2005 policy position on self-determination issued by Canada's largest Aboriginal organization, the Assembly of First Nations. According to the AFN's consensus, a consensus has emerged around a vision of the relationship between the First Nations of Canada, which would lead to strengthening recognition and the implementation of the First Nations of governments. Um, the vision of the AFN goes on to state, um, as it goes on to state, expands on the core principles outlined in the 1996 report to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, that is the recognition of the nation-to-nation relationship between First Nations and the Crown. The reason why that nation-to-nation thing is important is because that's how treaty laws are. Treaties are for international relations. On most U.S. maps, although the Indian so-called reservations are supposedly separate sovereign territories because they were done through treaties, right, as a nation to nation relationship under international law. Um, uh, the the hypocrisy of the United States has been to regard them as domestic dependent nations. That's the language that comes out of John Marshall and not just Johnson v. McIntosh, but also it's a trilogy of cases, Johnson v. McIntosh, Worcester versus Georgia, and Cherokee versus Georgia. It's the Johnson trilogy is sometimes what those court cases are called, that says that all Indians are wards of the U.S. government, right? So it's this manipulation of a way of talking about relationships. So when Coulthard here up in the Canadian context here is talking about a nation-to-nation relationship, that's important. It's important because also like these days in the liberal politics of recognition, it's like, oh, the city of Denver is going to recognize and have a city-to-city relationship with um uh uh I don't know, Cheyenne folks or something like that. Or we can't have like government to go like city to this or it needs to be international. When people are doing that, it looks like great, like they're doing like, oh, we're finally like drawing some recognition to this, and we're doing land acknowledgments and all this sort of stuff. But uh, what it does is it deteriorates the international law, the treaty law of nation to nation. So that's again why it's important to think in terms of that. In the early 1920s and 30s, like as the League of Nations gets set up, and then the later United Nations gets set up, you have indigenous leaders going and seeking recognition in those international bodies because of the colonizer government, like in the United States, for example. That turns into a discussion in the 1970s on the rights of indigenous people that percolates and all the way up until the 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. My colleagues, Glenn Morris and Tink Tinker, were part of the earlier talks in the 1970s. Indigenous groups at that particular time did decide to use the word indigenous as a collective term. So, yes, they know that it's not a real term, but it's a way that they could as a term that they could use to negotiate in international legal contexts, right? Um, and so that's something to think about. um, uh, my colleagues got very discouraged and left the talks early on because um, they kept from their perspective the talks just kept diluting all of the concepts in negotiations with the United Nations so that nothing much can be done about. There's no kind of like real legal recourse for Indigenous peoples. So it looks like a win, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it is in some ways a win, but it doesn't go far enough. The great Cherokee scholar Ward Churchill, in his book on genocide, A Little Matter of Genocide, talks about the whole problem with the Genocide Convention too. Like Raphael Lemkin has this term and a really like robust definition of it, and then once the UN Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide comes in with its legalized language, there's enough loopholes in the language that it's really hard to actually um, charge genocide. Although, of course, we're having lots of discussions right now in the international community with what's going on in Israel and Gaza, right, as being a matter of genocide. Uh, so coming back to Coulthard here, nation to nation is important there. Um, he says when recognition has emerged as the hegemonic expression of self-determination within the indigenous rights movement, it would appear, sorry, that recognition has emerged as the hegemonic expression of self-determination within the Indigenous rights movements in Canada. It's not just a problem that the Canadian government or something is using it, it's that his own people have adopted this strategy of looking for recognition from something outside. Then he goes on to Charles Taylor's essay, The Politics of Recognition from 1994. Um, which is a big influential thing here. And of course, Taylor is an influential Canadian philosopher. Um, he says much of this literature has tended to focus on the relationship between the affirmative recognition of societal cultural differences on the one hand, and the freedom and well-being of marginalized individuals and groups living in ethnically diverse states on the other. In Canada, it's been argued that the synthesis of theory and practice has forced the state to reconceptualize the tenets of its relationships with Indigenous peoples, whereas prior to the federal 1969 federal Indian policy was unapologetically assimilationist. Now it is couched in the vernacular of mutual recognition. Um, he says he's going to challenge in this essay the idea of the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state, the Canadian state, and that he's going to challenge the idea that it can be transformed by a politics of recognition itself. Um, he says against people who want to say like, oh, let's recognize each other, let's have I'll uh, let's have a land acknowledgement ceremony. Say, um, yeah, I'm really sorry about all of that, but I get to keep the land, right? Um, uh, he says against the recognition position, he says he argues that instead of ushering in a era of peaceful coexistence grounded on the Hegelian idea of reciprocity, the politics of recognition in contemporary form promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonial power that indigenous peoples' demand for recognition have historically sought to transcend. So I think it's pretty clear what his argument here is. And then without reading through the rest of his essay, I just want to sort of look at this from an intro to critical theory perspective and look at what he's doing as a thinker, right? So he turns to Fanon, an earlier critical theorist, and he's going to turn to Fanon because Fanon has a way of reading Hegel's master-slave dialectic in the master slave dialectic, um, uh, the slave's recognition, the moment of consciousness in Hegel, is when the slave recognizes that the slave has the power and the master does not have the power, right? But what has happened in colonial context, as Coulthard argues here, is that um, the that's not exactly how it works in colonial contexts because you might have people who were slaves who are then freed. It's like, oh, you're all free now, but you're basically still doing slave labor, right? So there has been in colonial contexts the people who are oppressed have not been able to have that moment of recognition. Um, where Fanon ends up pushing it, and he has a chapter on this in his other book, his famous book, Wretched of the Earth, called Concerning Violence, is that there must be this kind of taking up of arms, that's the only way that revolution can happen is if there's actually violence. So, of course, Lenin, right? And this is like going back to last week and Vladimir Lenin saying the same thing about Bolsheviks, like that that if there's going to be a revolution, it necessarily must be violent. And because of that, that like Fanon at this point in his career that Coulthard is latching onto is saying that it can't be just like something that's done in the mind, right? It has to be tied to some sort of action, and the action has to be violent. Um, uh, um, as he says here, in Hegel's account, on Hegel's account, the relations of recognition are deemed constitutive of subjectivity. One becomes an individual subject only in virtue of recognizing and being recognized by another subject. This insight into the intersubjective nature of identity formation underlies Hegel's often quoted assertion that, quote, self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The classic liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill are basically going to have a very similar type of attitude, like they're complete colonizers. It is not the case that in classic liberal thought, like that Mill, that you can just have a conversation with a native person and have it be an argument. The person has to be cultivated, Christianized, and go through a whole process of development before you can regard them as equal and before you can have an intellectual debate with them. Right. So that's the white superiority or the Euro-Christian superiority built into liberalism of the early 1800s. And as has to do with a similar thing to Hegel over on the continent, right? That there is something about a process by which two subjects might recognize each other as something like equals, right? And that process itself is part of a Euro-Christian, or what Barbara Mann, a great Five Nations scholar, says, Seneca scholar, Onondaga, uh, she says, she calls it Euroforming, in her book, The Gantoweses, or Iroquoian Women. Really, that's another way. So it's only through a Euroforming process, and this is like what Indigenous people are dealing with constantly, is that they have to enter into this whole apparatus and way of thinking and language like sovereignty, and in that process to start using the colonizers' terms, they end up being colonized themselves, sometimes like without even knowing it, or in advocating for recognition, right? Like the Coulthard is saying about the Dene government here. He spends time unpacking Hegel. Um, he says, for Hegel, the revolution of the slave is not simply to replace the master while maintaining the unequal hierarchical recognition. This, of course, would only temporarily invert the relation, and the slave would eventually meet the same fate as the master. Rather, as Robert Williams reminds us, Hegel's project was to move beyond the patterns of domination and inequality that typify asymmetrical relations of recognition. As such, it is also on this point that many contemporary theorists of recognition remain committed. But he says this is a problem. He says Pacha Markel has recently suggested that one of the most significant differences between the recognition in Hegel's master slave and the politics of recognition today is that state institutions tend to play a fundamental role in mediating relations of recognition in the latter, but do not in the former. So this is interesting, I think, from a critical theory perspective, because this is kind of like what Marx and Feuerbach were saying about Hegel to begin with. It was like, Hegel sees the state as a Euro forming or a Euro Christian, and particularly Christian forming apparatus, right, that will help people to become better citizens. But what Feuerbach and Marx have said is that what it does is it creates an ideology out of Christianity and uses that to support the bourgeois rationalism, and the hierarchical uh, up-down process of that. And so for them, that's where the state sort of gets in the way. Now, Coulthard isn't so much dealing with Marx here, but he does deal with Marx in Redskin White Masks later on. So I just want to like throw that out there, like from a critical. Now that we've done some critical theory and we can see this trajectory that I've been mapping out in our course this semester, you can see, maybe you can see some of this stuff, and why, like why doing critical theory might be a good way to approach some of these issues. Which isn't to say, of course, that it does well with Indigenous people or anything like that. Like that doesn't quite work, as Russell Means, the American Indian Movement guy, says in it. He claims that Marxian revolutions are just another form of Euro-Christian domination, right? He's got a big essay, talk. It's also an essay from the early 80s called "In Order for America to Live, Europe Must Die." So that's something to look at from Russell Means, great thinker in his own right. Um, uh, Coulthard says, while it's true that the normative dimension of Charles Taylor's project represents a marked improvement over Canada's past tactics of exclusion, genocide, and assimilation, in the following section, I argue that the logic undergirding the dimension, where recognition is conceived as something that is ultimately granted or accorded to a subaltern group or entity by a dominant group or entity, prefigures its failure to significantly modify, let alone transcend, the breadth of power at play in the colonial relationships. um, and so, again, just sort of like going back to Hegel, Hegel thematizes the master-slave relationship as two subjects that are coming into a form of mutual recognition. Um, but of course, in the colonial situation, we're dealing with states, so we're dealing like with like a completely different kind of entity than a human subject. Um, uh, and even so, I think what Coulthard is saying is that when we really look at Fanon's critique of Hegel, we can see that not only is it the case that like that the master-slave dialectic doesn't quite work in colonial contexts, but that um, there's something inherently colonial about even the way that it is set up within the Hegelian context. So he turns from on the account of Hegel to Fanon and the problem of recognition in colonial contexts. Um, so digging into theory, he says Fanon's concern with the relationship between human freedom and equality in relations of recognition represents a central and recurring theme in Black Skin, White Masks. As mentioned at the outset of this essay, it was there that Fanon convincingly argued that the long-term stability of a colonial system of governance relies as much on the internalization of the forms of racist recognition imposed or bestowed on indigenous population by the colonial state and society as it does on brute force. And so one of the things it gets mentioned in this section here, one of the famous uh, um, event in Frantz Fanon's life is that, he is a French citizen coming from the Caribbean. And there's a way to think like, oh, well, we're just all French, right? We go to French school, and race doesn't exist. But then he goes to Paris, and there's this little girl with her mom who points at him and says, "Look, mom, a Negro. Look, a Negro. I'm scared. I'm scared." And at that point, Fanon says that, like, even like a white child can locate him and put his whole identity into question. Like he can never be regarded as a full citizen, as a full man, or a full French person without the racialized aspect going on as well, and that's internalized in his own thinking as well, right? So um, we don't get to just like step out of the internalized process of racialization and racial oppression just through sort of some sort of legal saying. And so this is where he's a psychologist too, Fanon is, right? And this is of course what he means by the internalization of the forms. And this is exactly what Coulthard is saying, is that when indigenous people are using the politics of recognition, or they're advocating for their own so-called self-determination under the guise of recognition, then they're just going through that same process of internalization. So something else needs to be done. Um, uh, This is the section where he's talking about the little girl. He says, far from assuring Fanon's humanity, the other's recognition imprisoned him in an externally determined and devalued conception of himself. Instead of being acknowledged as a man among men, he was reduced to an object among other objects. Um, so he says that even though Charles Taylor purports to be drawing on Fanon and Black Skin, White Masks, he doesn't think that Taylor's reading goes deep enough. So that's why he's correcting Taylor by going back to Taylor's source, Fanon, and then he's seeing something in Fanon that's been overlooked, right? He says, I believe that a close reading of Black Skin, White Masks renders problematic Taylor's approach in several interrelated and crucial respects. The first problem has to do with its failure to adequately confront the dual structure of colonialism itself. Fanon insisted, for example, that a colonial configuration of power could be transformed only if attacked at both levels of operation, this objective and the subjective. Both the internalized, like colonization of the mind, right, is another way of putting it, and then also the externalized conditions of oppression, whether that's um, wage, like inequitable wage labor, or outright slavery, right? uh, He says Fanon correctly situated colonial capitalist exploitation and domination alongside misrecognition and alienation as foundational sources of colonial injustice. What this is like what happens with a lot of my Euro-Christian students who've never learned anything about Native Americans growing up is that they misrecognize things all the time, or they missituate Native peoples as being somehow in some distant past or something. Why can't they just get over the past? Or like when a problem comes up, like how are we going to fix this right now? It's like they want to like jump to the end of things without really confronting the violence of the history in this situation and how dire it is for folks, right? So I see this happen on a regular basis. Um, or at one conference that we had put on, we had showed a documentary, and a white woman got up and left the room, and she's just, I can't do this anymore. This is just too depressing, and left. And that's exactly the kind of sort of privilege. It's like she doesn't have to regard any of this stuff. And so in doing that, she chose to not recognize um, not only the past, but her own implication in the past, which because she has the power to just say like, oh, this is this is too sad. I don't want to deal with this right now. Um, Fanon correctly sees this problem. He says, quote, the Negro problem, wrote Fanon, does not resolve itself into the problem of Negroes living among white men, um, but rather of Negroes being exploited, enslaved, despised by a colonialist capitalist society that is only accidentally white. So it can't just be about the black-white thing, but we have to see how black and white and racial misrecognition is part of the apparatus of oppression itself. It's a tool of the colonizer in order to colonize, which is exactly how modern race sort of erupts. Why skin color racism is different than the way that races were talked about in the early modern or ancient world. And with that, also, I think when we look at slavery in the modern world as chattel slavery, as the slave who's literally regarded as a piece of a property or an extension of the colonizer master, the brutality of that is at a such it's at an even harsher pitch than slavery in the ancient world as well. So Fanon was enough of a Marxist to understand the role that the capitalist economy plays in over determining hierarchical relations of recognition. However, he was also much more perceptive than many Marxists in the instance, his insistence on that the subjective realm of colonialism be the target of strategic transformation along with the socioeconomic structure. The colonized person, quote, must wage war at both levels, again, insisted Fanon. Since historically they influence each other, any unilateral liberation is incomplete, and the gravest mistake would be to believe in their automatic interdependence. For Fanon, attacking colonial power on the one front, in other words, would not guarantee the subversion of its effects on the other. This is why a Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. Um, Here, Coulthard says that he would argue that Fanon's stretching of the Marxist paradigm constitutes one of the most innovative contributions to classical Marxist debates on ideology. And for us as critical thinkers, this is like I'm wanting us to pay attention to the ways that critical thinkers have updated, transfigured, or critiqued Marx in some sort of way, rather than like relegating the whole discourse of critical theory into like a really superficial claim that we're just Marxists. Of course, Wendy Brown had her own critiques in the earlier lecture this week. In Fanon's work, not only is the relationship between base and superstructure posited as both interdependent and semi-autonomous, but more significantly, those axes of domination historically relegated in Marxism to the superstructural realm, such as racism and the effects it has on um, those subject to it, are attributed a substantive capacity to structure of the character of social relations. And again, I would say that that's part of him doing the psychological work. And when we compare him to Marcuse, for example, Marcuse, writing around the same time, is trying to give accounts of Freud because he's trying to bring in a kind of psychological aspect. Remember, I have characterized critical theorists from the 1940s-ish as trying to account for the irrational kinds of things, and also in addition to trying to give a cultural account of things, whether we're talking about Horkheimer and Adorno, who are dealing with mass culture critique, which we're going to look at next week, or whether we're thinking about someone like Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci is um, in his prison notebooks comes up with the critique of hegemony, right? That showed up earlier on in this essay, the idea of a kind of like soft control of power by an oppressive government, that hegemony works in terms of culture. So that's all something that's emerging here, and Fanon just happens to be dealing with it in explicitly racial terms as well. We'll look at the colonizer and the colonized from Albert Memmi in a few weeks here as well. Um, as Coulthard goes on here, he starts talking about some more recent critical theorists, Nancy Fraser being one of them, great feminist critic. But he says, from redistribution to recognition, to use Nancy Fraser's formulation, he says, according to Nancy Fraser, whereas proponents of redistribution tend to highlight and confront injustices in the economic sphere, advocates of the newer politics of recognition tend to focus on and attack injustices from the cultural realm. On the redistribution front, proposed remedies for injustice range between affirmative strategies like administration and welfare, or more transformative methods like the transformation of capital, of the capitalist mode of production itself. In contrast, strategies aimed at injustices associated with misrecognition tend to focus on cultural and symbolic change. Again, this could involve affirmative approaches such as the recognition and reaffirmation of previously disparaged identities, or these strategies could adopt a more transformative form, such as the deconstruction of dominant patterns of representation in ways that would change everyone's social identities. For Fraser, um, and he's gonna give a little critique to Fraser here as well, though. He says, I think that Fanon's work, which anticipates the recognition redistribution debate um, by half a century, highlights several key shortcomings in the approaches of both Taylor and Fraser. Taylor's approach is insufficient insofar as it tends to, at best, address the political economy of colonialism in a strictly affirmative manner, through reformist state redistribution schemes like granting certain cultural rights and concessions to Aboriginal communities via self-government and the land claims. Although this approach may alter the intensity of some of the effects of colonial capitalist exploitation and domination, it does little to address the generative structures in the case of racially stratified capitalist economy and the colonial state. Um, he again ties this to criticism, um, to early Marx as well. He says down here, historically, indigenous demands for cultural recognition have often been expressed in ways that have explicitly called into question the dominating nature of capitalist social relations. So that when we actually look at what elders are saying in indigenous context, it's not just like we want to be able to like do our dances, or like we want to um, uh, have drumming and not have a SWAT team come and arrest us for noise violations in the middle of the night, which is something that happens back east in the United States. Um, Peter Derrico has a new book called Anti-Indian Law, and he talks about that in his book, Federal Anti-Indian Law. There's a phenomenon in the United States that gets birthed after the Johnson v. McIntosh um, case that becomes this apparatus called federal Indian law. But Derrico rightly points out that it's actually federal anti-Indian law. Or as Vine Deloria says, he recounts in the book, Vine Deloria is a great Standing Rock Sioux scholar who's passed now, but he says the problem with federal Indian law is that there's no Indian in it, right? Uh, so um, he points to Mohawk scholar Taiyaki Alfred, has lots of great work by Alfred as well. And he comes back, he says that my point here is that an approach that is explicitly oriented around dialogue and listening ought to be more sensitive to the claims and challenges emanating from these dissenting Indigenous voices. If you are going to be in dialogue, listen to what they're actually saying. Um, he says Fraser proposes a means of integrating struggles for recognition with those of redistribution without subordinating one to the other. To this end, Fraser suggests that instead of understanding recognition to be the revaluation of cultural or group-specific identity and misrecognition as the disparagement of such an identity and its consequent effects on the subjectivities of minorities, recognition and misrecognition should be conceived of in terms of the institutionalized patterns of value that affect one's ability to participate as a peer in social life. To view recognition in this manner, writes Fraser, is to treat it as an issue of social status. And he says, although Fraser's status model allows her to curtail some of the problems she attributes to identity politics, it does so at the expense of addressing one of the most pertinent features of injustices related to mis or non-recognition. My concern is this: if many of today's most volatile political conflicts do include subjective slash psychological dimensions to them in the way that Fraser admits, and that Taylor and Fanon also describe, then I fear her approach, which attempts to eschew a direct engagement with this aspect of social oppression, risks leaving an important contributing an important contributing dynamic to identity relation forms of domination unchecked. By avoiding this psychologizing tendency within the politics of recognition, Fraser claims to have located what is wrong with misrecognition in social relations and not individualized or individual or interpersonal psychology. And this is again why he wants to return to Fanon, because Fanon is the psychologist and wants to um, account for the psychic baggage, right? Like the mental illness that comes from the colonial context. He says Fanon was unambiguous with respect to locating the cause of the inferiority complex of colonized subjects in the colonial status structure. The problem, however, is that any psychological problems that ensue, although socially constituted, can take on a life of their own and thus need to be dealt with independently and in accordance with their own specific logics. He says Fanon argued that the dialectical progression to reciprocity in relations of recognition is frequently undermined in the colonial setting by the fact that, unlike the subjugated slave in Hegel's phenomenology, many colonized societies no longer have to struggle for their freedom and independence. And then the people who say that they're free, like put them into a kind of bootstraps mentality and just says like, oh, if you're not, if you're not doing well in society, it's because there's something wrong with you, right? You're not working hard enough. Um, you're poor because you want to be poor. Um, you're homeless because you're lazy. Something like those types of ideas. Um, he says the first involve the he's talking about some reformed possibilities here, and he says, simply stated, for Fanon, it is through struggle and conflict, and later through violent struggle, that the imperial subjects come to rid their arsenal complexes. And so this is becomes a discussion of transformative praxis. He says, I will have more to say about this aspect of Fanon, but he says he's going to argue that transformative praxis serves as the mediating force through which colonized people the colonized can come to shed their colonial identities, thus restoring them to their proper place. Um, Again, he wants to focus on double levels of subjection. I'm not going to keep reading all of this stuff because I've gone on a little, I think, long enough. Here, again, he returns back to Hegel. And he eventually gets to a discussion of Nietzsche and affirmation that there, and he does say quasi-Nietzschean here in the text that maybe that's something that needs to happen for indigenous people to um, attack the psychological domination, is that there needs to be this kind of like affirmation of existence that doesn't come from a politics of recognition itself. My former dissertation director, Luis Leon, had a similar interest in Nietzsche that way for Chicano folks in his book on religious poetics. I'm forgetting La Llorona's Children in Luis's book does that. Some of my other native colleagues will warn against aligning too much with someone like Nietzsche because Nietzsche is a Euro-Christian in his own way. But Coulthard, so just emphasis on the fact that Coulthard says quasi-Nietzschean at that point in his essay. Um, uh, oh yeah, this file gets kind of messed up here at the end. So he moves. So what he eventually moves toward is, and this is like I think in the conclusion of his essay, which I don't have access to here right now, um, is that he just kind of restates what he's been saying here, like that the dominant thinkers, the Nancy Frasers, the Charles Taylors, the people who are promoting liberal politics of recognition under multicultural policies, especially the ones that come out in the 1990s, they take a small step forward, but they end up actually the problem is that when we celebrate that and we say that like, oh, yay, like everybody, we're all multicultural now, um, they haven't changed anything at the structural level of what the colonial of how colonial oppression is working, and then it leads people to think like that they have dealt with an issue of injustice towards indigenous peoples when they really haven't, right? So it ends up being not just it's not just that it doesn't fix the problem, is that is the problem is that it says that the problem was fixed and then now we can move on with things when that's not what happens. And he wants to give special attention again to the psychological formation of people who are colonized and thinking about ways to negotiate that particular situation, which can't be done through the kind of mutual politics of recognition. They need um, uh, uh, um, something more affirmative that can't be reduced to identity politics either. So it becomes a difficult thing. Let me see if I've got the end of his essay on, I think I've got it up online somewhere here. Yeah, towards the end. Yeah, this is just the downloaded file that I was highlighting. Uh, I'm just gonna kind of skip, just look at his last paragraph here, just for closure's sake. Um, he has some really nice questions here at the end. He says, in Canada, I think that the strategies and tactics adopted by a growing number of today's Indigenous activists in reserve settings like Grassy Narrows and Six Nations, or in the urban centers of Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Toronto, have begun to explore the emancipatory potential that this type of politics offers, a politics that is less oriented around attaining an affirmative form of recognition from the settler state and society, and more about critically reevaluating, reconstructing, and redeploying culture and tradition in ways that seek to prefigure alongside with those with similar ethical commitments, a radical alternative to the structural and psychoaffective facets of colonial domination discussed above. And I think that we saw movements like it's a similar. So up in Canada, the big protest movement was the Idle No More movement. Um, and recently, um, closer to where I live, there was the Dakota Access Pipeline, the up at Standing Rock a few years ago or before COVID. Now it feels like a long time ago. But they are part of a resurgence of native culture that I think can't again be reduced to just that kind of neoliberal version of identity or identity politics. It's something deeper than that, but it's something that needs to avoid using not only the politics of recognition, which is what liberalism is wants to do, but without using the even the legal concepts that come from the Euro-Christian model, like sovereignty. So it becomes a really, really rigorous process of decolonizing the mind and also of being super, super attentive to language in the ways that we use language and cognition. So it becomes a deep discussion about psychology, about our mental habits of mind. And then it becomes really, really useful in terms of just critical theory in general. And that's why, again, I think that for doing contemporary work, Indigenous people are doing such amazing um, critical theoretical work. Leanne Benisumbo Sake Simpson, for example, another Indigenous person from the Great Lakes region, has a great book called um, As We've Always Done, right? I think is one of her books. And she's got several books, but that's kind of a great theory book. There's a Robin Wall Kimmerer's recent book, Braiding Sweet Grass. A lot of the tension in Indigenous writings is a kind of processual decolonizing practice of decolonizing the habits of our mind and the habits of our way of living. Mark Freeland's recent book on Indigenous worldview, Ozhay Deasy, is his book, and amazing, amazing critical theory as well. So I've given us just a little bit of a dip into Coulthard's work because I wanted you to see how here's an Indigenous scholar who's engaging with the critical theory tradition. Yes, he's read as Hegel. Yes, he's read as Marx. In Red Skin, White Masks, he reformulates Marx's theory of prior accumulation, which is an interesting thing. It's just not like it's just something if you're interested in that, you might look at in a future project or something like that. And I wanted to mention it, but I'm not gonna give an in-depth account of Marx's prior accumulation of capital right now because it wasn't in the essay for today. I hope that you got something out of this, and uh, uh, yeah, we will continue on. We're going to go back to the 1940s now, to Horkheimer and Adorno, and look at that shift to mass society. And we're going to kind of be building through. We will read now some post-colonial theory, and what I'm trying to get my students to understand is like how theory kind of develops throughout the 20th century. And so when we get to later discussions about race and like even like critical race theory and things like that, we can see the dimensionality from a much deeper level, where those discussions are coming from. And then hopefully we avoid some of the really like dumb uh, um, surface level political discussions about something like critical race theory, when we have a longer and deeper look. Okay, have a great day, morning, afternoon, whenever, wherever you are. And we'll check back in with you again later on.